What do you do when the man who destroyed your faith in love becomes the only one who can save you? Damien Cross hadn't looked at a woman truly looked in 3 years. Not since the accident. Not since Charlotte's car went over the bridge on their wedding night, her white dress trailing in black water like a ghost he could never quite bury. He'd built walls higher than his Manhattan penthouse, turned his heart into something cold and efficient as the empire he commanded. $29 billion couldn't buy back the dead, but it could buy silence, distance, control. Then Ella Monroe walked into the hallway of his private floor, carrying a single suitcase and a smile that felt like daylight forcing its way through concrete. "You must be my neighbor," she said, extending her hand as if she didn't know who he was. As if everyone in New York didn't know the story of Damien Cross. The tech magnate who'd sworn off love at 28 and spent the next 5 years proving money mattered more than a pulse. He stared at her hand, delicate fingers, no rings, paint stains on her knuckles cerulean blue and burnt sienna. An artist. His building didn't have artists. His building had hedge fund managers and oil heiresses and people who understood that the 52nd floor meant you valued privacy over conversation. "There's been a mistake," he said. "This floor is private, not anymore." She dropped her hand but not her smile. "I'm 5 to be, you're 52. I guess that makes us neighbors whether you like it or not." Something dangerous flickered in his chest. Something that felt uncomfortably like curiosity. She was nothing like Charlotte. Charlotte had been porcelain and pearls. Old money sophistication. A woman who knew how to navigate his world because she'd been born into it. This woman wore ripped jeans and a sweater with paint stains, her dark hair escaping from a messy bun, eyes the color of whiskey and sunlight. She looked at him like he was a puzzle she wanted to solve rather than a cautionary tale to avoid. "The building made an error," Damien said, already pulling out his phone. "I'll have my assistant arrange alternative accommodations. The Pier, the St. Regis. Take your pick. I like this one." She nudged her suitcase with her foot. "Plus, I already signed a year lease. Paid 6 months up front. Turns out your building manager is more interested in money than whatever weird Howard Hughes situation you've got going on." The insubordination should have annoyed him. Instead, he found himself studying the angle of her jaw, the way she stood her ground, despite being 8 inches shorter and approximately $1 billion poorer than him. "I own the building," he said quietly. "Then you should fire your property manager." She picked up her suitcase. "Nice meeting you, neighbor. Try not to brood too loudly through the walls." She disappeared into 52B before he could respond. The door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a challenge. Damien stood in the hallway, his private hallway that had been empty for 3 years by design, and felt something crack in the careful architecture of his isolation. He called his head of security. "Run a complete background check on the woman in 5 to B. I want to know everything, where she's from, where she banks, who she knows, and Marcus." He paused, watching her door, as if it might reveal its secrets. "Find out who approved her application. Someone's about to lose their job." That night, he couldn't sleep. Not unusual, he rarely slept more than 4 hours, but tonight was different. Tonight, he could hear music through the walls. Something classical, a piano concerto that made him think of rain and melancholy and things he'd locked away. He found himself standing at the window that overlooked Central Park. The city sprawled beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered but never quite owned, listening to a stranger play Chopin through expensive drywall. The background check arrived at 2 a.m. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening with each line. Ella Monroe, 26, Masters in Fine Arts from Yale, orphaned at 16, worked 3 jobs to put herself through school, moved to New York 6 months ago, showed her work at a small gallery in Brooklyn that was barely breaking even. No family, no trust fund, no connections that would explain how she'd ended up in a building where apartments started at $15 million, except they're buried in the financial records a single payment that made his blood run cold. The lease wasn't signed by Ella Monroe. It was signed by Jonathan Cross, his uncle, the man who controlled the Cross Family Foundation. The man who'd been pushing Damien to move on and find someone new for the past 3 years. Damien's phone was in his hand before he could think, dialing the number he called twice a year at most. "Nephew." Jonathan's voice was smooth, amused. "Bit late for a social call. What did you do?" "I helped a promising young artist find housing. The foundation supports the arts. You know this, on my floor, in the apartment next to mine. Coincidence has a lovely sense of poetry, don't you think?" A pause. "She doesn't know, Damien. She has no idea who helped her or why. I simply saw an opportunity to assist people who might benefit from each other's company. I don't want company. You want a mausoleum. There's a difference." Jonathan's voice softened. "Charlotte wouldn't have wanted this. You know she wouldn't." Damien ended the call, his hand shaking with rage or grief or something he refused to name. He should have Ella evicted immediately, should have her removed from the building before morning. But something stopped him, some stubborn part of himself that wanted to prove he could live next to someone, could occupy the same space as another human being without falling apart. He could ignore her. He was exceptional at ignoring things. The next morning, Ella knocked on his door at 7 a.m. He opened it to find her holding a casserole dish, flour on her cheek, wearing an oversized shirt that said starving artist with a price tag that read free to good home. "I made breakfast," she announced. "Technically I made breakfast for myself, but I made way too much because I'm still learning New York apartment ovens don't work like actual ovens. So now you're getting breakfast whether you want it or not. I don't eat breakfast. Everyone eats breakfast. Some people just eat it at noon and call it brunch." She thrust the dish into his hands. "It's a frittata. Don't overthink it. Just eat it before it gets cold and my feelings get hurt." She started to leave, then turned back, her expression shifting into something more serious. "Look, I know you didn't want a neighbor. Your face yesterday made that pretty clear. But I'm here, you're here, and we're both adults who can handle basic human civility. I'm not going to bother you. I'm not going to try to be your friend, but I also won't pretend you don't exist. Deal?" He should have said no. He should have said no, should have handed back the frittata and closed the door. Instead, he heard himself say, "Deal." Her smile was devastating. "Good to see you around." 5-2. For 3 days, he successfully avoided her. He left for work at 5 a.m., returned after midnight. He was a ghost in his own home, a phantom CEO who existed only in boardrooms and virtual meetings and expensive cars with tinted windows. Then Friday night, he came home to find Ella sitting in the hallway outside her door, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red from crying. Every instinct screamed at him to keep walking, to disappear into his apartment and lock the door and pretend he hadn't seen. But she looked up, and something in her expression, raw, unguarded, completely stripped of the confidence she'd worn like armor, made him stop. "Are you hurt?" The words came out rougher than he intended. She shook her head, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just a bad day, bad week, bad month if I'm being honest." She laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "The gallery dropped my work. Said it wasn't commercial enough, which is code for nobody wants to buy paintings that make them feel things." He should have offered condolences and left. Instead, he found himself sitting down beside her on the cold marble floor, his $1,000 suit crumpling against the wall of his hallway. "Show me," he said. "What?" "Your work. Show me what they rejected." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was serious or simply humoring her. Then she stood, unlocking her door and gesturing him inside. Her apartment was chaos incarnate, canvases everywhere stacked against walls, hanging from makeshift hooks, propped on every available surface. Paint supplies covered the kitchen counter. The living room had been transformed into a studio, natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows she must have fought to get uncovered. But the paintings, God, the paintings, they were extraordinary. Raw emotion rendered in color and texture, grief and joy and rage and tenderness, all bleeding into each other like wounds that refused to heal cleanly. He moved through the space slowly, studying each piece, feeling something crack wider in his chest with every canvas. "These are remarkable," he said finally, his voice quiet. "They're uncommercial." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Nobody wants to hang depression on their walls. That's not depression." He stopped in front of a massive canvas, deep blues and blacks with threads of gold breaking through like hope refusing to die. "That's survival." When he turned, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You get it. I understand loss." The admission cost him something. "Your work is about loss. My work is about what comes after." She moved to stand beside him, the part where you have to figure out how to keep breathing when everything that mattered is gone. They stood there in silence, to people who understood something fundamental about catastrophe, surrounded by the evidence of her heart spilled across canvas. "I'll buy them," Damien said. "All of them." "What?" "No, you can't just—" "I'm not being charitable. I'm being practical. My buildings, I have 18 residential properties in Manhattan alone, need art, real art, not the soulless garbage decorators usually suggest." He pulled out his phone. "I'll pay fair market value, more than fair, and I'll want new commissions. Pieces for every property." "Why are you doing this?" "Because looking at your paintings is the first time I've felt anything in 3 years. Because you knocked on my door with a casserole and treated me like a human being instead of a cautionary tale. Because I'm terrified of what it means that I can't stop thinking about you. Because they're good," he said instead. "Business is business." Her eyes searched his face, and he wondered what she saw there, whether she could read the lies he told himself about motivation and professional distance. "Okay," she said finally, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "Have dinner with me. Not as a patron. Not as a neighbor. Just as two people sharing a meal." She smiled, but there was something vulnerable in it. "I'm tired of eating alone." He should have said no. Should have maintained the boundaries he'd built so carefully. But she was looking at him like he was human, like he was someone worth knowing beyond his net worth and his tragedy, and he couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at him that way. Tomorrow, he heard himself say, 8 p.m., my place. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Damien Cross realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in agreeing to dinner, but in believing he could keep his distance. In thinking he could exist beside Ella Monroe without consequence. 3 years ago, he'd promised Charlotte's ghost he would never love again. Never risk the devastation of loss. The particular agony of hope transformed into horror. He'd built an empire on that promise. Turned himself into something untouchable. But Ella Monroe painted survival like prayer, and Damien was starting to suspect that some promises were meant to be broken. The question was whether he was brave enough to let his heart break open one more time, or whether the cost of loving again would destroy what little of himself he had left. Damien spent 6 hours preparing dinner, something he hadn't done since Charlotte taught him to make coq au vin in her mother's kitchen. He dismissed his chef, his staff, everyone who might witness this uncharacteristic vulnerability. When Ela arrived at 8 wearing a simple black dress that somehow made her look more devastating than any gown at the Met Gala, he forgot how to breathe. She brought wine chip, cheerful, completely wrong for the Milan. He loved her for it, though he wouldn't let himself use that word, not even in the privacy of his own fractured heart. They talked until 3 a.m., sitting on his balcony overlooking the city that never dimmed, and he told her things he'd never told anyone, about growing up as the heir to impossible expectations, about Charlotte's laugh and the way grief had turned him into stone, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from you. Ella listened with her whole body, leaning forward, eyes catching moonlight, and when she finally touched his hand, just her fingers brushing his knuckles, it felt like resurrection. "You're not stone," she whispered. "You're just scared of proving it." The next 3 weeks dissolved into a pattern that felt dangerously like happiness. Morning coffee on his balcony where she'd appear with terrible puns and paint-stained fingers. Afternoons when he'd leave board meetings early to watch her work, mesmerized by the way she attacked canvas like she was fighting something holy. Evenings when they'd cook together, his kitchen finally alive with laughter and burnt garlic and the kind of easy intimacy he thought he'd buried with Charlotte. He was falling, and he knew it, and he told himself he could stop any time he wanted, even as he memorized the way her neck curved when she concentrated, the small scar above her left eyebrow, the sound of her breathing when she slept on his couch after wine and old movies. Then Marcus called at midnight with information that made Damien's blood turn to ice. "Sir, you need to know something about Miss Monroe. Her presence here, it's not coincidence. My team found communications between her and a journalist named Rebecca Chen. They've been planning this for months. She's writing an expose about you, about Charlotte, about everything you've kept private. Miss Monroe's been gathering material, taking photos of your apartment, recording your conversations. The whole thing is a setup." He confronted her the next morning, slamming the evidence on her kitchen counter: printed emails, text messages, a contract with New York Magazine for a feature titled "The Billionaire Who Bought Loneliness." Ella's face went white, then red, her hands shaking as she picked up the papers. "Damien, let me explain. Yes, Rebecca approached me. Yes, I considered it. At first I was desperate, broke, and she offered me money I desperately needed, but I never went through with it. I told her no. These messages are from before I met you, before I knew you were anything more than some tragic figure in the tabloids, before you knew I was worth more as a story than as a person," he said, his voice like winter. "Did you enjoy it, Ella? Playing the struggling artist, making me feel human again? Was it good material, watching me fall for you?" The words tasted like poison, but he couldn't stop them, couldn't stop the rage that felt safer than the devastating hurt beneath it. She reached for him and he stepped back, watching something die in her eyes. "Get out. I'll pay out your lease, but I want you gone by tomorrow. And if one word of what I told you ends up in print, I will destroy you so completely you'll wish you'd never heard my name." Ella was gone by evening. The apartment next door empty except for one painting she'd left propped against his door, the blue and gold survival piece he'd first admired, with a note on the back in her handwriting: "For when you remember that surviving isn't the same as living. I'm sorry I couldn't make you believe me. I'm sorry that I fell in love with someone who will never trust anyone again." He stood in his apartment surrounded by luxury that felt like a mausoleum, holding the painting like it might explain how to breathe around the devastation in his chest. And for the first time since Charlotte died, Damien Cross let himself cry. 3 days later, his uncle Jonathan appeared at his office unannounced, looking older than Damien remembered, tired in a way that suggested bad news. "The girl is telling the truth. Rebecca Chen approached multiple people trying to get inside information on you. Ella turned her down. There's a recording of their final conversation where she explicitly refuses to participate." Chen got frustrated, started fabricating evidence to make it look like Ella was involved. She wanted to destroy both of you for rejecting her previous interview requests, Ella for refusing to betray you. "I have proof, Damien, audio, video, everything. You threw out the one real thing in your life because you were too afraid to believe in it." Damien found her in a studio apartment in Brooklyn that made his penthouse look obscene by comparison. Her eyes hollow with exhaustion, paint under her nails and fury in the set of her shoulders when she opened the door. "Come to make sure I'm sufficiently destroyed?" she asked, and the bitterness in her voice cut him open. He held out the evidence Jonathan had given him, watched her flip through it with trembling hands, saw the moment she understood what had happened, how thoroughly they'd both been manipulated. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of his mistake. "I was wrong. I was terrified. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that feeling nothing was safer than risking everything, and then you made me feel everything and I panicked." "You didn't just panic, Damien, you eviscerated me. You looked at me like I was poison, like everything we shared meant nothing, like I was just another person trying to profit from your tragedy." She threw the papers back at him, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. Do you have any idea what it cost me to let myself care about you? I knew who you were, the man who'd turned grief into a fortress, who'd rather die alone than risk being hurt again. I knew it, and I fell for you anyway, because I thought maybe you were brave enough to try, but you're not. You're a coward, Damien Cross. You're so terrified of losing someone that you'll destroy them first, just to prove you were right about love being dangerous. You're right, he said, and something in his voice made her stop, made her really look at him for the first time since he'd arrived. I am a coward, I'm terrified. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life without you than I am of losing you. Charlotte died, and it broke me, and I thought the answer was to never let anyone close enough to break me again. But Ella, you didn't break me. You made me want to be whole. You made me remember that surviving isn't enough, that hearts are supposed to beat for something more than just obligation and empire. I was wrong, I was cruel, and I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me. She kissed him then, sudden and fierce, her hands fisting in his shirt like she was trying to hold him and push him away simultaneously. And he tasted salt from her tears and sweetness from her mouth and 3 years of loneliness dissolving in the space between one heartbeat and the next. When they finally broke apart, she was trembling, her forehead pressed against his, breathing hard. I can't do this halfway, she whispered. I can't be your project or your redemption or your way of proving you're healed. If we do this, you have to actually do it, the messy, terrifying, absolutely insane business of loving someone who might leave, who might die, who might break your heart in 1,000 ways you can't control. Can you do that? Can you actually love me without armor? In answer, he pulled the ring from his pocket, not Charlotte's ring, which he'd finally buried with her memory in a box he'd never open again. But something new, a sapphire, the color of Ella's survival paintings set in platinum. I bought this 2 weeks ago, before Marcus called, before everything fell apart. I was going to wait, do it properly, but I'm done waiting and I'm done with proper Ella Monroe. I'm offering you everything, the terrifying, uncontrolled, absolutely insane version of my heart. It's battered and it's been buried and it might not work right, but it's yours if you want it. Marry me, not because it's romantic or because it's what people do, but because I can't imagine existing in a world where you're not the first thing I see every morning and the last thing I think about at night. She said yes with tears streaming down her face, and for exactly 8 hours, Damien Cross believed in happy endings. Then his mother called from the family estate in Connecticut with news that made his blood freeze. The board was staging a coup, led by his cousin Marcus, who'd been feeding him false information about Ella all along, and they were using his erratic behavior and unsuitable engagement as evidence he was unfit to lead Cross Industries. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Monday, if he didn't appear with a strategy to save his reputation, which meant ending his engagement to a broke artist and announcing a merger marriage to Senator Whitmore's daughter. He'd lose everything his family had built over 4 generations. He told Ella everything in her tiny apartment while rain hammered against windows that leaked, water pooling on floors she couldn't afford to fix, and watched her face transform from joy to devastation to something harder, something that looked like resignation. You should go to them, she said quietly, pulling the ring from her finger with shaking hands. I won't be the reason you lose your legacy. I won't be the thing you resent in 10 years when you've lost everything that defined you. Damien, I love you, but I love you enough to let you choose your family, your company, the life you were born to lead. He tried to argue, but she pressed the ring back into his palm, kissed him one soft final, tasting like goodbye, asked him to leave before she changed her mind and begged him to stay. Friday night he sat in his penthouse surrounded by lawyers and advisors mapping strategy for Monday's board meeting. Everyone talking at once about optics and damage control and appropriate matches. And all he could think about was Ella painting alone in Brooklyn, the space on his finger where a ring should be. The way she'd said, I love you, like it was both a gift and a sacrifice. His mother touched his shoulder, her voice gentle in a way it rarely was. Damien, sweetheart, I know this hurts, but you have responsibilities. 60,000 employees depend on you. Your father built this company for you. Charlotte would have understood due to she was raised to understand these things. This artist, she's lovely, I'm sure, but she doesn't belong in our world. Saturday he drove to Brooklyn at 2 a.m. and stood outside her building in rain that soaked through his suit, staring up at windows dark because she'd painted over them for privacy, and knew he was going to lose either way. Lose the company and become a cautionary tale, the billionaire who destroyed his legacy for infatuation. Or lose Ella and become exactly what he'd been before she moved in next door, a breathing corpse in expensive suits who'd forgotten that hearts were meant for more than pumping blood. He turned to leave and found her standing behind him in the rain, barefoot, wearing his old Yale sweatshirt she must have stolen, crying. I can't let you go, she said. I tried. I painted for 16 hours straight trying to paint you out of my system, and all I did was fill canvases with your face. Tell me what to do, Damien. Tell me how to stop loving you. Marry me tomorrow, he said, rain and desperation making his voice rough. Not next month, not after the board meeting. Tomorrow. I'll lose the company, lose the family name, lose everything except you. And it will be enough. Ella, it will be more than enough. I spent 3 years learning how to be empty, and you spent 3 weeks teaching me how to be whole. And I would rather be whole with you in a studio apartment than empty in a penthouse. Tomorrow say yes." She kissed him in the rain like she was drowning and he was air. And he understood then what Charlotte never taught him, that real love wasn't about deserving or timing or circumstances aligning perfectly, but about choosing someone so completely that the world could burn and you'd still consider yourself lucky. They married Sunday at City Hall with Jonathan as witness, Ella in a vintage dress from a consignment shop that cost $40 and made her look like Starlight. Damien in jeans because they'd gone straight from her apartment without him changing. Both of them exhausted and terrified and more certain than they'd ever been about anything. The clerk who married them looked bored until she saw how they looked at each other, then smiled and said, "Whatever you two have, bottle it. You'll make a fortune." Walking out into afternoon sunshine wearing mismatched rings they'd bought from a street vendor for $20, Damien felt something settle in his chestnut piece exactly, but purpose. Tomorrow he'd face the board. Tomorrow he might lose everything. Today he had this. Monday morning he walked into the boardroom at Cross Industries headquarters with Ella beside him, her hand tight in his, facing 27 board members who looked at her like she was a stain on expensive carpet. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his presentation already loaded: financial reports, tabloid photos, a psychological evaluation someone had clearly paid for. "Damien, we're giving you one chance to salvage this. Annul the marriage, agree to the Whitmore arrangement, and we'll forget this episode, or we vote, right now, and you lose everything your family built." The room went silent, everyone waiting, and Damien felt Ella's hand start to slip from his. She was trying to give him an out, trying to sacrifice herself again, and he gripped harder. "Vote," Damien said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 generations and one perfect choice. "Because I'm not annulling anything. I'm not marrying Lillian Whitmore. And if you think for 1 second that this company matters more to me than the woman standing beside me, then you never understood what my father actually built. He built a legacy, yes, but he built it so his family could have everything: success and love and lives worth living. You want me to choose duty over happiness? You want me to become the kind of man who sacrifices real love for stock prices? Then you don't deserve to represent the Cross name." He looked at Marcus, at his mother, at faces he'd known his whole life. "I vote to remove myself as CEO, effective immediately. Ella and I are leaving." The boardroom erupted, but Damien was already walking out, Ella running beside him, both of them laughing like criminals escaping a heist, and they made it to the elevator before his mother's voice cut through the chaos. "Damien Alexander Cross, you stop right now." She stood in the hallway looking smaller than he remembered, older, and when she spoke again her voice cracked. "Your father would have been so proud of you." She walked forward, took Ella's hand, studied her with eyes that missed nothing. "I spent 30 years in a marriage arranged for business. I watched your father die never knowing what it felt like to choose love over duty. You're braver than both of us." She turned to the boardroom. "I'm invoking my override as majority shareholder. There will be no vote. Damien stays as CEO, and if anyone has a problem with his marriage, they can tender their resignation." That night, lying in Ella's tiny apartment because his penthouse felt like a museum and this felt like home, Damien traced the line of her spine and tried to find words for what he felt. She turned in his arms, moonlight catching the planes of her face, making her look ethereal. "You would have really walked away from everything," she whispered, and it wasn't quite a question. "Yes," he said simply, because there were no other words that mattered. She kissed him soft and slow, her hands mapping his face like she was memorizing him, and when she pulled back her eyes were bright. "Then I guess we better make sure it was worth it." 3 months later, her first solo exhibition opened at the Museum of Modern Art. Every piece sold before the doors opened, and Damien stood in a room full of critics and collectors and society. People who'd spent months gossiping about his inappropriate marriage, watching his wife shine like she'd swallowed the sun. Someone asked him if he regretted his choices, if the scandal had been worth it, and he looked at Ella across the room, paint still under her nails despite the designer gown, laughing with genuine joy at something a young artist was telling her, and felt his heart do that thing it only did for her. "I don't believe in regret anymore," he said. "I believe in choosing love even when it's terrifying, especially when it's terrifying." That night on their balcony overlooking the city that had witnessed their entire story, Ella showed him her newest painting, a man and a woman standing in rain, holding each other like the world was ending and beginning simultaneously. "I call it the promise," she said softly, "because you taught me that some promises are meant to be broken and some are meant to be kept forever." He pulled her close, breathing in paint and jasmine in the scent of home, and made a silent promise to Charlotte's memory. "Thank you for teaching me to love. Thank you for releasing me to love again. I hope wherever you are, you're proud of who I became after I stopped being afraid." Then he kissed his wife under stars that witnessed everything, and Damien Cross, who'd sworn never to love again, discovered that the heart's capacity for joy was infinite, that survival became living when you found someone worth breaking open for, and that the best promises were the ones you made not in certainty but in wild, terrifying, absolutely perfect hope. 6 months after the museum opening, Damien woke to find Ella's side of the bed empty. Sunlight streaming through windows she'd insisted on keeping uncovered because she said watching dawn break over Manhattan was like witnessing daily resurrection. He found her on the balcony painting a canvas propped on the easel he'd had custom made, wearing nothing but his dress shirt from last night's charity gala, her hair wild from his hands, feet bare against cold marble. She didn't turn when he approached, just leaned back into him when he wrapped his arms around her waist, and they stood like that watching the city wake up, her brush moving in careful strokes, his chin resting on her shoulder, breathing synchronized like they'd been doing this for lifetimes instead of months. "Coffee," he murmured against her neck, and she laughed that sleepy morning laugh that never failed to undo him completely. In the kitchen that had been sterile before she'd filled it with her chaos mismatched mugs, a collection of terrible magnets from every bodega in Brooklyn, her painting apron hanging where his chef's white coat used to live, he made her coffee exactly how she liked it. Too much cream, 2 sugars, a sprinkle of cinnamon she'd never admit to wanting. He brought it to her with toast. She wouldn't eat because she never ate when she painted, watched her take a sip without breaking concentration, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost pain. This was his life now. This sacred ordinary magic of mornings and coffee and a woman who painted survival like prayer. Thursday they had lunch with his mother at the family estate, and Damien watched Eleanor Cross, who'd once suggested Ella was unsuitable, teach his wife the secret to her famous lemon cake while sharing stories about his father that made them all cry laugh into expensive wine. "He would have adored you," his mother told Ella, cupping her face with flour-dusted hands. "Not despite who you are, but exactly because of it. You remind me of who I was before I learned to be appropriate. Thank you for teaching my son that inappropriate is sometimes the most honest thing we can be." Driving home, Ella's hand in his, she said quietly, "I think I just got adopted by a billionaire," and he kissed her knuckles and replied, "Welcome to the family business of being loved." Friday evening, Marcus's actual head of security, not the cousin who'd tried to destroy him, called with news that made Damien's jaw tighten. Rebecca Chen was publishing her piece anyway, a vicious expose titled, "The Billionaires Bought Bride," claiming Ella had trapped him through manipulation and pregnancy lies. He hung up and found Ella in her studio, told her everything, watched her face cycle through hurt to anger to something calmer. "Let her publish it," she said finally. "People who matter know the truth. People who don't matter will believe what they want anyway. Damien, I'm not afraid of her or tabloids or anyone who thinks love can be bought. I'm only afraid of losing you, and that's the one thing her words can't do." Saturday they volunteered at the art program Ella had started for underprivileged kids in Brooklyn, and Damien found himself teaching a 12-year-old named Maya how to mix colors while Ella demonstrated technique to a cluster of teenagers who looked at her like she was magic. "Is that your husband?" Maya asked, pointing at him with a paintbrush dripping cerulean, the really rich one from the news. Ella glanced over, her smile soft and private and meant only for him. "That's my husband," she confirmed. "The really lucky one who figured out that money can't buy the things that matter." Maya considered this seriously. "What matters?" she asked, and Ella looked at Damien like he was the answer to every question she'd ever had. "Finding someone who makes you braver than you are alone." Sunday morning, Damien disappeared for 3 hours, came back with paint in his hair and conspiracy in his smile, and refused to explain despite Ella's interrogation that involved both threats and persuasion techniques that left them tangled in sheets, breathless and laughing. "You'll see tonight," was all he'd say, kissing her thoroughly enough to derail further questions. At 7 he blindfolded her, "Trust me," whispered against her temple, and drove her somewhere she couldn't identify by sound alone. Led her by the hand through spaces that echoed, upstairs that went on forever, until finally he stopped and the blindfold came off and she gasped so hard she forgot how to breathe. They were standing on the roof of her old Brooklyn building, the place where she'd lived in that studio apartment before everything changed. But he'd transformed it completely. String lights everywhere like captured stars, candles and hurricane glasses lining every surface. And in the center a single canvas, the survival painting she'd given him the day she left, the blue and gold piece that said everything about breaking and healing. "You gave me this when you thought we were ending," Damien said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to give it back to you now as a beginning. Ella, we got married in a rush because we were terrified of losing each other. We said vows in front of a board clerk who forgot our names before we left. I want to do it again properly. Not because the first time didn't count, but because every moment with you counts, and I want this one to be something we remember." He pulled out new rings, hers, a custom piece incorporating colors from her paintings, his, a simple band engraved with coordinates of the Brooklyn rooftop where they now stood. "I promise to choose you every morning even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promise to believe in your art when galleries don't, in your strength when you forget it, in our love even when it scares me. I promise to make you coffee and listen to Chopin through walls and never ever take for granted the miracle of you deciding I was worth the risk. Ella Monroe Cross, you saved my life by teaching me that surviving isn't living. Will you keep saving me, every day, for the rest of our lives?" She was crying, laughing, nodding, and then she was kissing him like she could pour every unspoken promise into the space between their mouths. "I promise to paint you into every canvas whether you're there or not," she said when they finally broke apart. sliding his ring on with shaking hands. I promise to knock on your door with terrible casseroles and worse jokes until you remember how to smile without thinking about it first. I promise to love you on the days when grief for Charlotte visits, because loving you means honoring everything that made you who you are. Damien Cross, you didn't save me, you met me exactly where I was and decided broken was beautiful. I promise to do the same for you, every day, even the ones where we forget how. They stood there as the city lit up around them, Brooklyn and Manhattan blending into one endless constellation, and renewed vows that nobody witnessed except the universe and each other. Later, back in the penthouse that had finally stopped feeling like a mausoleum and started feeling like a home, they lay in bed with the windows open to let in September air that tasted like possibility. Ella traced patterns on his chest, her wedding rings both sets now, the street vendor specials and the custom pieces catching moonlight. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your uncle hadn't arranged for me to move in next door? She asked softly. If we'd never met, never crashed into each other's carefully constructed isolation. Damien caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm, considered the butterfly effect of fate and coincidence and uncles who believed in meddling for good. I think I would have spent the rest of my life being half alive, he said finally, pulling her closer until there was no space between them, until her heartbeat was indistinguishable from his own. I think I would have built empires and attended galas and been respected and feared and completely empty. You didn't just move in next door, Ella, you moved into every locked room in my heart and refused to accept that closed meant permanent. You're the most terrifyingly wonderful thing that ever happened to me. She kissed him slow and deep, a kiss that tasted like promises kept and futures written in tandem, and when she pulled back her eyes held galaxies. I love you, she whispered. And somehow after everything, the accusations and the board meetings and the stolen moments and the vows said twice, those three words still carried the weight of revolution. I love you more than art, more than pride, more than the independence I thought I needed. You make me want to be brave enough to need someone. That's the scariest, most beautiful thing I've ever felt. He answered by showing her exactly how thoroughly he loved her back, with hands and mouth and whispered words that blurred into moans, into laughter, into the sacred language of bodies learning each other for the 1000th time like it was the first. Dawn found them back on the balcony, Ella wrapped in a blanket while Damien made eggs neither of them would eat. And as the sun transformed Manhattan from shadow to gold, she said something that made him stop mid-motion. Spatula suspended, heart expanding beyond what he thought ribs could contain. I'm pregnant. 3 words. Tiny revolution. He was across the room before thought, kneeling in front of her, hands shaking as they cupped her still flat stomach. And for the first time since Charlotte died, Damien Cross thought about the future not with dread but with desperate, terrifying hope. They cried together, laughing through tears, making plans in whispers like speaking too loud might shatter the fragile miracle of new life. And in that moment he understood that some contracts became gifts, that strangers became home, that the heart's capacity to break open and heal and love again was infinite as long as you were brave enough to let it. And that the woman who'd moved in next door carrying a single suitcase and impossible hope had given him back not just his life but the future he'd stopped believing in, one morning coffee and terrible joke, an act of wild courage at a time.